This is a production of Cornell University.
So as Louis said, my name is Kirsten Workman. I am currently a senior extension associate with ProDairy, which is an extension program at Cornell in the Cowles College of Ag and Life Sciences, and we're actually housed at the Animal Science Department. I am a certified crop advisor, and I have my master's in agronomy, so I'm sort of like an agronomist interloping in the Animal Science Department, which is kind of fun, but I will try to recruit some of you that way, so it's okay. Just a raise of hands here, students in the room. Awesome. And other people who have extension appointments or do extension work, I recognize some faces. Awesome. Great. Other just plain old faculty. Okay, great. Super informal, right? My audience is usually farmers and their service providers. So feel free to heckle me, raise your hand, yell out, whatever, and stop me. I will try to leave about 10 minutes for questions. So I was telling Louis, usually I cram like 2 slides per minute. I was good and only put in like 30 something today. So just a little bit about myself. So just some context for ProDairy, and I'll get into a little bit to how extension works here at Cornell, but we have Cornell Cooperative Extension, which I'm sure you all have heard about, which operates just a little bit differently than people who have extension appointments on the university. So I'm one of those campus-based extension professionals. But the ProDairy program was started over 30 years ago and was funded through New York State. Mostly the Department of Agriculture. And really the goal of ProDairy was to enhance New York's dairy industry through education and applied research, which is really the mission of extension in the land-grant university. So our goal is to sort of facilitate economic development by increasing competitiveness and sustainability of our dairy farms here in New York State, of which there are many. I came from Vermont just before this, where we're down below 500, and we have almost 4,000 dairy farms here in New York State. So big difference there. But we kind of cover the whole farm. So we have folks like myself who are extension specialists that cover every area of the farm, from forage systems, my area of nutrient management, environmental sustainability. We have a herd health specialist. We have a whole team of engineers looking at environmental systems, manure storages, and energy production, and other facilities. Farm business management. We have a small cost share program. We help fund environmental and business best practices, and we actually also have a youth program director. So anything related to the dairy farm, we try to cover. The original model of ProDairy is that extension associates like myself were paired with faculty members on campus. That doesn't exactly happen anymore. We could have a conversation about that later, maybe, about how fewer and fewer of our faculty have extension appointments, and as those folks have retired or moved on, they don't always get replaced. And so I think I might be one of a couple of our senior extension associates in ProDairy that still has that connection with a faculty member. So I'm part of the Nutrient Management SPEAR program, Dr. Corrine Kettering, so I'm sure you guys are all aware of. And we partner together, and that program's mission and goals is quite aligned with mine. And Corrine, Dr. Kettering's, has a very substantial extension appointment, so that matches up. So she does a lot of the applied research. I dabble. But my role is to get her research out into the hands of farmers and their service providers. As Louis said, I'm old. I now have to put 20 plus years of experience, which makes me sound legit, but also makes me sound old. That's okay. And I'll go into my career and all that as we go. So I do like to sort of describe myself as an optimist and a pragmatist. I think anyone that works in agriculture sort of has to have both of those qualities. And so I sort of operate under those auspices. So I will, whenever I'm in front of students, I like to talk a little bit about my career path. Not that it's fancy or exciting, but I think it's helpful to hear how other people get where they are. So I currently have the role of like a state specialist, essentially, for extension, which I still sort of like don't quite buy into yet, but that's okay. But clearly I didn't start there, right? So I actually got my undergraduate degree at a small liberal arts school in Washington State called Pacific Lutheran University. My major was environmental studies. Kind of housed in the geology department, but it was a very broad, it was a Master of Arts, so broad, everything from economics and ethics to science and above. So out of college, pretty much, I got a job with a soil and water conservation district in the Olympic Peninsula part of Washington State in Mason County, and worked there for several years. And then actually took a little bit of a detour, and I worked for the Nisqually Indian Tribes Natural Resource Department. And you might think like, what? But in Washington state, our Native American tribes are actually by law co-managers of all the natural resources. And in the Puget Sound, you can imagine that's relies heavily on fisheries, particularly salmon and shellfish. And so they have a robust natural resource department that helps manage that resource. And I was part of that team doing kind of education outreach on environmental practices for other landowners to protect water quality for the resource of the fishery. But actually in between those two things, there was this idea of our soil and water conservation district partnering with our local extension office, which was very appealing to me. But as you can imagine, having two different organizations try to figure that out took a little bit of time. Well, the minute I took this job, they sort of figured it out. And so I quickly had to say goodbye to my Nisqually friends. And I took this position as the small farms water quality educator for Washington State University Extension. And that was a joint position between those two organizations. And what was really interesting about that, and I love this model and would love to see more of it, is that I got to leverage the best, the advantages of both those institutions and sort of work around the challenges of both those institutions. So I did make sure I was in both offices physically every week but clearly the same farmers I was working with, same geographic region, so that wasn't difficult. But when I needed low overhead for a grant proposal, I would go through the conservation district. When I needed a lot of resources or information or research expertise, I would look to WSU. So it was a really great combination. So that was about 10 years or so. It's my home state. I then got married, had a couple kids. I'll talk about some other little bird walks we took. But as just a series of events, we ended up in Vermont, where my husband's from, and I took a position as an agronomy outreach professional for UVM Extension, working in the Lake Champlain watershed. I do want to say that while I was there, I took advantage of the resources and benefits of that position and did some professional development. So that's when I got my certified crop advisor certification, which I still have. And I also got my master's degree as an employee while I was there. And luckily, my research project aligned with my day job. And so, except for taking classes and writing, my research actually got to be part of my day job, which was nice. And then I came here in January of 2022. So I did say there were some bird walks, but while I was in kind of the end of the last 5 years of my time in Washington, my husband and I owned a farm called Barnyard Gardens. We also opened a retail nursery location associated with it. And when we moved to Vermont, it was actually for my husband's job that he accepted a new and emerging role at the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, where he sort of developed and grew what was called the farm at VYCC. And it was a youth development project, but they instead of going out and fixing trails and building lean-tos, they took that same model and grew food and distributed it through a hospital system called the Healthcare Share. And we got to live there, and I got to basically have cows, which was my goal. That I will say that really helped with my career, right? Before I got my master's degree, I used to joke that farming was my master's degree, because it really gave me that applied knowledge that I could connect with my other producers and farmers. I could understand where they were coming from. I understood their economics. I understood the work ethic. I understood the market pressures. I understood, the weather, like all those things I was able to relate with them with. And even here in Vermont, right, I was even able to do things like custom graze some heifers for some of the farms I worked for, or go milk a herd of dairy cows on the weekends, or use their manure in some of my research projects. So it was a good sort of synergy for me as my own professional development. And I really, really value that applied experience, although it does make for a busy schedule. Okay, so anyone here know what a land-grant university is? What does that mean? Some of you should know. Yes.
Oh, you're gonna ask?
Yeah, you raised your hand.
The land-grant university system was established after the Civil War, and it was established to create a university in every state of our nation in granted land.
Yeah.
It's become controversial, Indian land.
Yeah.
But it's an amazing model because it allowed the general person to gain access to education, higher education.
And in the areas of agriculture and economics and things that were really important to the development of our country. What is your name, by the way?
Oh, my name is Allison. My ancestor was Justin Moore.
which you know is from Vermont, right? Okay, exactly. You answered the question perfectly, right? So the US government, the way they funded the formation of a university in every state were these sort of like grants of land, but you kind of had to figure out where they were. So I think that's where we get to like, well, whose land was it and whose was it to give away? So in New York, actually, does anyone know where our original land grant was? In the northern Pinelands of Wisconsin. And so Ezra Cornell was able to get it. So our land grant allotment for New York was 990,000 acres. And they sort of divvied it up by population. Of course, in the 18, whatever we were at, 64 or something, I have the dates on my notes, so I'll pull it up maybe if you guys want to see it, or I'll share them. I have actual data in there about the dates. But essentially, right, we had 990,000 acres for New York allotted. For reference, Vermont had like 30,000 acres. So pretty sparsely populated. It was sort of relative, right? How many people do you have to serve? Ezra Cornell, in my research, which was really interesting, of course, Ezra Cornell, right, didn't do the quick and easy thing and just sell it, because the idea was you would sell this land, you would gain the income from the sale, and you would use that to start your university. Ezra was a much better businessman than that, and so he was able to convince the people putting together this university with him to wait until the land was worth more and they could maximize that profit. And I think it was something upwards of $5 million at the time, which was a lot of money, but they had to wait to realize the return on that investment. And so I think things were a little tight there for a little bit. And the university was really founded with an endowment from Ezra. And then when he passed away, before it all sort of came to fruition, the folks who sort of helped him through this land grant purchase maintained that goal of his to wait until it was really worth a lot of money. And I don't know if any of you recognize this, if you ever park near Morrison Hall, right? The land grant mission really aligned with Ezra Cornell's mission, where the idea that any person could come and access education on any topic. So what about extension? What is extension? It's a hard question. You want to take a stab at it? Got some extension people here.
Primary wing of translational research, applied research. Basically, the questions are supposed to be coming from the stakeholders, and then we're supposed to be applying it in scientific method.
Right. So it's supposed to be based in the local community to say, what are the questions and challenges that we have ahead of us, and looking to us as the land grant university to help them answer that, right? So clearly the idea is that it's coming from the community up, and then we're going back, not sort of from top down, right? But it sort of happened both ways, I would say.
I don't know that it's also our responsibility to see what's coming.
Right, exactly. So us as extension folks, right, we're supposed to know what's coming and anticipate that and help producers stay ahead of the game. And that's really how it has worked over time. In the Northeast, basically like in the early 1900s, we were figuring this out, and many counties and states sort of created their extension systems just ahead of the actual, legislation and law that made it formal, probably a year or two before. And that was around, 1912 to 1906, sort of that range. And then in 1913, we had the Smith-Lever Act. It sort of solidifies extension and gives some sort of funding mechanism, which we now call formula funds in the form of the Smith-Lever Act. And again, based on your, where you are in the country and your population, all that stuff is the formula. And every state and university has to match those formula funds. And here in Cornell, we have a unique system where us as extension folks can then compete and apply for that funds. In some states, they just sort of decide where it goes, and it should have an extension component, right? But really the focus here, this is from Sullivan County, I think. But the point was that this was supposed to be community led. So these extension associations were actually boards and groups of local farmers and townspeople that would come up with the list of topics they wanted education on. And as you can imagine, in the early 1900s, a lot of that was on home economics and agricultural techniques. And that has very much evolved over time. And now, because it's very locally led, you could go to any extension office in New York, right, and find a different sort of priority or focus based on that community. So if you're somewhere where there's a lot of dairy farmers, you might have a very robust sort of dairy field crops program. If you're in New York City, right, we don't really cover that there. But you might have a lot of urban programs and youth development. So just depending on the needs of the community. They are sort of still in New York, the original model is sort of these like subordinate government entities. And so the way they are funded often is variable, but there's usually some connection to the county, some connection to USDA, and then they often have to do some fundraising. So here in New York, Cornell Cooperative Extension. Sometimes there's some university funding towards staff. There's county funding towards staff, and then they'll write a lot of grants and sort of creative ways to fundraise in order to fund their programs and their people. In some states, like where I came before in Vermont, we were just university employees. So I did not rely on a county government to fund me every year. So, and Washington sort of was like waffling between the two as I left. So it definitely changes and can be exciting, challenging. It just depends on where you're at. So that idea of applied research and education is really core, right, to the value and mission of Extension, and really being in the local communities, working alongside those farms to help them come up with solutions, and those change over time, right? Any questions about Extension? My goal is to recruit you all as students, as Extension employees eventually. There's lots of opportunities across the country. And I will say that the United States, right, is unique, that we're really the only country that has this system so well supported and implemented, and in every state, right, in our country, it exists in some way, shape, or form. And other countries really look to it as an example and pull people from our pool to help build and develop similar programs in other countries. So why is this land grant mission and Extension important? Clearly I'm biased, right? But one of my former colleagues at UVM, who is a vegetable specialist, I think put it really good. It's this idea of marrying technology, but really the idea of social capital becomes really important in our work. Because if we don't have the trust of farmers, right, are they going to take our advice? And if we don't listen to them and solve their problems, do they care about our work? And if my budget, depends on the county government, which is often made up of those same people who sit on town boards and county commissioners and things like that, it wouldn't pan out. So that's really key, and it really is this community of learning. And I know that Vern and my colleagues here in New York agree that we learn as much, right, from our work with farmers and our relationships with farmers as they're really learning from us. So, and it is pretty magical. So, right, what does it look like now? Kind of the same, right? Same ideas, same tenets, same concepts. But different, right? Farming is different. It's different than it was 100 years ago, 150 years ago. It's different than it was 20 years ago, and it's going to be different in 5 years, right? So the key for Extension and the land grant mission is to be anticipating and to be always looking forward, and to evolve with whether it's agriculture or natural resources or youth development, right? We don't in Extension only do ag. I'm going to focus on that, but so we have to evolve along with it. I think one of the biggest things in the last 10 years, really, and Louis, clearly his position is evidence of that, is that technology, information, data, right, precision agriculture has really changed how we think about farming and how we interface with farmers and their data. So that's something we're all learning. And the issues have changed, right? But in the end, it's really about people. So this is one of my CCE regional extension educators, Jody. She works in Western New York, right? Like, I can't be everywhere. This is one of our bigger projects. So Jody is the local extension agent, and we rely on her to give us a heads up if it looks like the farmer's going to plant corn and he hasn't called us yet, or if she's out there and notices they haven't done a very good job of weed control, or we just need her to help us sample that day because it's got to happen so we can get out of the field for the farmer to go about his way. So those relationships are really important. And again, right, they can provide us information about if we're headed in the right direction, because they are the boots on the ground locally too. So just some basic tenets here, right? Like, what's been key in my career and made me, I think, successful is really meeting farmers where they're at and saying, like, where are you, whether it's farming system, land-based, education, technology, scale, whatever it is, and understand what the barriers are to them solving whatever problem and trying to remove those barriers. That's kind of what I really see as the role of Extension. And that takes the form, and it takes a lot of forms. So we think a lot about this applied research and education, but there's definitely a way to go about that. So those of you that have been to our research farm facilities, right, that's one way to do research. Frankly, I've done very little of that research. Almost all of my research has been on farms. And the reason is, as silly as it sometimes sounds, there might be farmers in one county and farmers in another county, and they might feel like whatever's happening over here doesn't apply to them. And so to do it in all the places where those farmers are becomes an important piece, and to listen to them about what they want to know and hear and see. Right? So I kept hearing like, yeah, plots. Like, That's great. They want to see the data. They always want to see the data. But if you're going to try and demonstrate or show something, they want it bigger. They always want it bigger. And they want it close by, right? So that's where extension comes in. And so we go from smaller plots to bigger plots. You know, we were having good soil health conversations. This was 10 years ago or more. And there's very different soils depending on where you are, right? And different landscapes. And so to dig a soil pit on one farm and do a soil health display, the results are completely different than when you go like 2 miles over and a totally different soil type. You know, the way we look at cover crops and demonstration plots and, you know, do I do this with real life farm equipment that is of the scale the farmers are going to use, whether it's big enough or also small enough, right, is important. And then, right, so this is just one example. I was just excited because 2 of my research projects showed up on Google Maps once. I was like, ooh, screenshot. This was my master's project, and this was a CIG project we had on cover crops, right? So these were small plots for my farmers. They were about 100 feet long. And then this is the whole length of a field, right, where we were showing off different sort of combinations of cover crops in a field, farmer's field. To all the way up to really what they want to know is what's it look like on a whole field or half a field split or something like that, right? And now I think with yield monitors and precision data now, a lot of Dr. Kettering's work currently is looking at how do we use that yield data so that farmers can do their own research and have it not just be like, this isn't replicated plots, I couldn't use this for statistics, but I'll tell you what, it sure changed a lot of farmers' minds, right? We can take the best of both worlds and actually get statistically valid data out of these when we have 1 million little yield data points from an entire field, if we do it right. The other role I feel of like for extension is like, I feel like it's my job to mess up first. It's my job to figure it out with the farmer, but I want to mess up on my dime before I'm like, yeah, you should do this. How many people have heard stories are like, well, 20 years ago, extension told us to do this, and now you're telling me to do that, right? So we want to make those mistakes and figure out all the kinks alongside the farmers, but in a way where we're kind of taking on the risk. And whether that's through equipment or application of practices or, you know, funding strategies, whatever that looks like, right? So as we were figuring out cover crops, right, we wanted to figure out the pitfalls before we were saying, yes, this is how you do it. What I'll tell you find is you need lots of different approaches, right? I always talk about we need the big toolbox with lots of tools in it, and then you'll know which situation is right for which tool, hopefully, but you'll learn. So this is just a couple examples, right? We have the winter radish cover crop and a winter rye cover crop. Both were dead, but clearly some differences here, right? Come June when the corn is growing. Similarly, right, we made a mistake here and we didn't get the cover crop killed. Oh, we figured that part out and now, right? So we go from the farm saying that doesn't work to saying, well, what did we do wrong? And then we fix it and then we can figure it out, right? And these are this plot is this one here next to the one where we clearly didn't do the right thing. So, you know, figuring those out along the way and sort of documenting the good, bad, and the ugly is also really important. So just figuring it out, right? This is just an example. I was working with a lot of farms on reduced tillage. And in this case, the farm called me, I think on a Thursday and said, hey, we've got 8 acres of corn left. We want to try this no-till thing. We have 8 acres worth of seed. I've got a small hay field I'm willing to give up. Can you get me 6 different sets of closing wheels so I can test them out? Well, I said, sure, Mark, when are you planting? Tomorrow at noon. Okay. I'm like calling every farmer I know, are you done corn planting? Because I'm going to take 2 of your closing wheels. So that's what we did, right? And they planted and we flagged each little set of rows and we came back and we did population counts and, right, did we change the world? No, but did that farmer keep trying no-till and asking questions? Yeah. So, you know, it's like, okay, that's important. And even when I collect data that's not statistically valid, right, I'm still able to share it with producers and say, you know what? It didn't really matter which wheel we used because they all closed the trench. So we did a good job kind of thing. Versus the one, right, that didn't, and we did see a difference on this farm. So here's another thing about sort of adoption and technology transfer. We had a small grant where we had 2 of these 10-foot no-till drills that we took all around the Champlain Valley to try and encourage cover crop planting, which worked pretty good because they're 10 feet and they drive down the road pretty easily. But you put them in an actual big field and the farmer looks at you like, what? That's going to take me forever to plant, right? So they try it for a few times. And then what do? Right? They bought a 30-foot drill, right? And so these 2 little 10-foot hay busters that we drove around in our little extension truck for a couple years, with some good coordination with our agency partners who funded some equipment purchases, turned into, in one county in Vermont, there's probably now 24 30-foot no-till drills that get used for planting cover crops every year. So was that worth a grant fund of, you know, $250,000 one year? Probably, yep. And just knowing, right, like, and then what we were doing here actually was planting some demonstration plots while the farmer was planting like the whole rest of the field in the same amount of time. But what happens is you will see that if, you know, starting small is important, taking incremental steps, but you have to be able to like adapt quickly because that's what the farmers are going to do once they adapt technology. And just to show an example here in Vermont, when I started there in 2011, there's like 100,000 acres of corn, a little less. And there was maybe 100 acres of cover crops planted on that corn ground. Some vegetable growers were doing it. But we, you know, started working with our NRCS partners, our state agency, the water quality folks, Extension, soil and water conservation districts, kind of all got around one issue. And we were able to start with like a small project with a helicopter, which I call charismatic megafauna, and get 5,000 acres done. It was okay. But by the end of like, this is 2018, and now we're sort of above that, we had a 35% adoption of cover crops on our annual cropland. Like that's pretty significant. So Vermont's a small state. There's not as many farmers. It's a little easier to get that kind of fast change, but still, you know, once you get that momentum, right, if you do your job well, you can see change happen really fast, which is frankly really rewarding. And again, right, not just the one practice, but whole systems. This was the soil type I was working in. Very heavy clay. So, right, has challenges. And people always said no-till doesn't work and cover crops aren't going to work, right? But very quickly, our farms went from some just basic cover crop applications to like doing all sorts of cool stuff. And I used to joke that like I just would go around following them and trying to take good pictures, right, and share it and get other farmers to come look at it. So like I said, once we've like convinced them, then they're like optimizing it to fit their system, which is really exciting. And then our job is just to sort of tell the story and convince them to tell the story, right? So this is one farmer I worked with in the Champlain Valley, George Foster. His son actually is the crop manager for Dumont Farms, one of the largest grain producers in New York State. And he was just, you know, this really quiet, demure fella, and he just became this champion. He's come here to talk in New York. He's been to national no-till conferences. I think I have a picture of him winning an award. And, you know, he's not like the guy you would have picked out of the room to be your spokesperson, but in the end, he really was. And we made a lot of headway because of farmers like George and his cohorts and getting them in groups of people to make big change. So we had 3 different farmer organizations that were formed to really address soil health and water quality. There they are. These 2 guys, not very excited, are they? That's my old boss. No, he was excited. That's his excited face. So they were able, you know, we formed this Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, which really showed some leadership. And like I said, could not have done what we did there without them. And they were able to win this award at a national no-till conference. And George and Dave got to go for free. So that was pretty exciting. It was his first time on an airplane, actually. It's pretty cool. And then the other piece for Extension, right? And I just came from a meeting of people that were not farmers, right? But this is more and more a part of our job, is to be the person that interprets farming to the rest of the public. I mean, we're below 2% of our population that are farmers. And it's been that way for long enough that most people don't have any context for farming. And so really that's our job, right? I mean, it's the farmer's job, but really it's our job as Extension, especially, to be that person that's doing the interpretation and in translation to our, you know, the public who don't have context. And I think in rural New York, in rural Vermont and other places, you often have people who have proximity to agriculture, but don't have context. So they definitely have an opinion, but it may or may not be based in fact, right? So I think about the person who drives behind the manure tanker on their way to work and it looks dirty and smells bad, and they have no idea what's actually happening, right? Or they see mud in the road behind it and think it's manure, or like I get a lot of manure complaints. But you know, that idea, then I can help explain herbicides and pesticides, man. That's some of my toughest conversations, but gosh, I'd rather have that one than have a farmer feel like they're being sort of vilified right in front of their neighbors. So if I can help that a little bit, like having the tough conversations, I feel like is where I live a lot these days. And this is our state and our CS conservationist talking to one of our farmers in Addison County about his manure injection methods, right? He didn't have to let these people on his farm, let alone all these other people. This is a student from Middlebury College. Gerard's a very outgoing fella. This student from Middlebury College, I was just sort of walking behind them eavesdropping, and she asked him about why he wasn't an organic farmer. And so they're having that conversation right there. And it was really awesome, right? Like she got to hear his perspective. He was respectful. So she was like, oh my gosh, perfect. So any questions about that? I have some other sort of lessons learned I'll get to here in a little bit, but I wanted to touch a little bit. Anyone here deal directly with sort of environmental issues as they relate to agriculture? Yeah, you guys can raise your hand. Okay, well, this is where I live as the environmental sustainability specialist. My entire career has at some level been dealing with water quality as it relates to our farming practices. So why do we think Extension, right, needs to be sort of involved in this arena if we're in terms of farming? I think it's really important. I think there's also this piece about regulation and whether people with the land grant university or Extension should be involved in shaping regulation or not. And then also, like, how do we build incentive programs for adoption? So this I just show, this is from the TMDL in Lake Champlain. I don't think it's the most recent version, but you can see here in the total watershed, 38%, which is not the majority, but it's the largest source, right, of the runoff into Lake Champlain from phosphorus was coming from agriculture. So clearly something that needs to be addressed, right? In Vermont, it was up over 40%. And so that's a space, right, where we got to be engaging, because if we don't engage, where do our farmers end up later, right? If environmental regulations either get developed without them or don't take into account actual farming practices, right, we could create regulations that put all of our farms out of business or have unintended consequences. And so I spend a lot of my life also here, especially now in my role at Cornell, helping people who run the concentrated animal feeding operation permit and water quality rules and now climate change. So those are all important pieces. I mentioned climate change. So we now have policies being formed. The first one's here in New York that will have some role to play in how we think about farming, right? We have a pretty small piece of the footprint, but we also have a big role to play in terms of solution. And we're early enough, if we can do it well, we can maybe avoid some regulation. This soil health piece, while not seemingly environmental, really to me it sort of is where all the things come together. And the reason I pointed out, not just because my soil health colleagues are here, but because this has been the space where I've seen the most sort of like eyes light up from farmers, right? So you can be addressing all sorts of goals when you talk about soil health. That can include production, right? But also can include reducing your environmental footprint and being more profitable and a lot of different things. And farmers are producers, right? They get excited about that. So when I've never had a farmer text me a picture of their nutrient management plan getting finished, right? Like, oh, yay, woohoo, my nutrient management plan showed up, right? But they do send me pictures of like, hey, this is my no-till cornfield. Look at all the earthworms. It's really cool. Or handfuls of soil that look beautiful, right? On a cornfield that's been under really good management for 10 or 12 years. And it's a place where we can really sort of think about where it comes into context with our community and watersheds and airsheds and all of the above. And unfortunately, right, when it comes to the environment, I mentioned like the public has a role to play. Like without the public pushing for good environmental regulations, right, maybe we would never have had the Clean Water Act, which I think we would argue we needed the Clean Water Act. But it can kind of swing the other way, right? So here we have a water quality practice. Manure pits are one of our #1 ways to protect water quality, so we're not spreading manure in the winter. And we have neighbors who like don't want them, right? And will protest, send their kids up there, right? They'll accuse the Soil and Water Conservation District executive director of like being in the pocket, right? And gaining some sort of financial benefit from this idea. So it gets very emotional, right? And so that's a position where, we sort of have to think about how do we craft our message and how do we bring science to the conversation, which is becoming really difficult too. So science communication is big. And then we get into even worse things, right? Where farmers are getting sued. So I've had the lovely privilege of being a witness on a lawsuit against a farmer, right? Where that puts you in a difficult position. And now we have another one, right? So New York State, we have a current lawsuit that's going through litigation. We're in the discovery phase right now of a farm that frankly is in complete compliance with their CAFO permit. But now they're paying a lawyer tens of thousands of dollars a month to just defend what they're doing and what we've been asking them to do for 20 years through our permitting process. And so, you know, it's not going away. So a few lessons I think I've learned along the way. If I haven't already mentioned them, right? This idea of expert, this is Gerard again. Are you the expert or are you part of a cohort, right? So are you the person standing up? What's the, one of my colleagues that does social research for Extension said it's more of a guide by your side versus sage on the stage, right? So instead of standing up talking about what we should be doing in farming, right? You should be next to your farmer, helping them come up with solutions and helping them interpret information. That's what I feel like I do a lot of too. Like, yes, we have some information, but what does it mean to you? Right, the other role I think that's been really helpful in my career is I just think of myself as a convener, right? So there's people doing really cool stuff. My job is to make sure the right people know about it, right? So we had a cool project with a grassland manure injector, right? You have a field day, people get excited, they want to see equipment, they want to look at it, right? Lots of good conversations, you get more adoption, people see things on the ground. And that could be a group like this. It could also be two farmers who are neighbors, but they never have enough time to like check each other out or see what's going on or just like feel uncomfortable asking. And I say, oh, do you mind if I bring so-and-so over to take a look at your corn planter? Sure, whatever, you know, and then those conversations start to happen. The other piece, right, is really the base mission of land grant universities and extension is we do have to measure, right? We can't manage anything without measuring it first. And farmers know that, right? But they also have a lot to do. And so if I can make that measurement part easier, I think that's a good role to play. And then helping them make those management decisions, you know, and I say here the basics are still important. Here we're calibrating a manure spreader, and here we're just leveling, the ripper, right? And that's just little things. It's just basic agronomy. It's not like new and exciting science, but it's a good reminder that like, oh, right, the basics of agronomy are still really important in how we farm, even with all this other technology we have in front of us. So I'll tell you, farms always overestimate how much manure they're spreading. People think they underestimate, but every time I calibrate a manure spreader, they were underestimating. I think the other piece that I've come to realize that, you know, how do you feel when someone shows interest in your work and they say, oh, tell me about what you're doing, right? Like, oh, that's cool. Someone cares about, oh, and they thought it was kind of cool and they want someone else to hear about it and they want me to come talk about it. And, you know, I didn't do this intentionally this way as like a social experiment, but as I started doing more and more of this and working with groups like the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, and we have in New York, the Partners for Healthy Watersheds, like when you go to, like, how many times does a farm or a farmer have anyone interested in what they're doing other than like, okay, who needs the truck and what piece of equipment, but like someone from outside their farm to be like, oh, what are you doing? Really? That's so cool, right? Like it is. Do you mind would you come talk to some people about it? That's like, oh, okay. Like I get up in the morning every day and do this thing and like someone actually thinks it's kind of cool. And I think that has gone a long way, frankly. There's my charismatic megafauna, big, cool equipment. It's like really exciting. People love it. It's not always the right solution, but it gets people out to a field day. You can see the people underneath that high clearance. We were spreading cover crop seed in between tall, very tall corn plants with that machine. The helicopter was the same. So again, this idea about the question about whether or not to get involved in regulations and policy. And I've had some, I don't want to say heated, but robust conversations with my extension colleagues over the years about if this is a role for extension or not. And I'm not going to tell you there's a right or wrong answer. I will tell you that I've been grateful when I have been involved in those spaces, mostly because if we're going to have regulations that A, are implementable and B, actually accomplish the goals we're setting out to do, we have to involve the people we're trying to regulate. And it's really hard to get farmers to that process. And so I see my role as getting farmers to the process for input, but also to bring data so that those decisions get made in a way where it's based on actual information and not just assumptions or something that happens somewhere else. And this can be in a lot of ways. This happens in labor, This happens in the environmental space. It happens, animal welfare. So, thinking about, for me in my career, if I had not participated in some of these policy and regulatory processes, not me personally, like I made some wonderful contribution, but knowing if we had not engaged in that space as extension and conservation districts and farmers, the outcome would have been not as good. Mostly because I think the farmers would not have received it well. Like, you want me to do what? But when they're there at the table, they're like, okay, well, it could have been worse, right? Or actually, they were going to make us do this. Or, then they can tell their neighbors, like, oh, no, actually, this is legit. And then again, just being that mistake maker, problem solver, not assuming you have all the right answers and just, literally shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, trying to work through stuff together. And then the most important piece of our work in extension really is the people, right? The other people in extension, the people in the communities, your local government folks, and of course, the local farmers that we're working with. And we just have to always keep that in the front. It's like, this is community, this is people. There's anyone that's ever worked in extension is like, wait a minute, I have all the scientific knowledge I need, I have all this, but no one gave me a counseling degree. I've been at tables where farms and families are in tears. Like, well, I was just here talking about fertilizer. I didn't sign up for this, right? So it's very much a people process, not just a science data information process, and remembering that that's important. And what I've found is it's really important to convey that to the other people in your community, because often the farm gets pointed at and people forget that it's the farmer, right? And he's a person, and he might have yanked your car out of the snowbank last winter, and he probably is on your school board, and he's on the fire department or whatever. So I try to always keep that at the forefront of my conversations with people. And the best way I do that is I get farmers to show up and talk to those people. And just real quickly here, some adoption, right? Just to show it does work, right? We've learned that if you look at the state here, the orange number is like the whole state, 30% adoption of tillage and cover crop. But when we focus on a priority watershed and like their needs and issues, what kind of adoption do we get up? It gets up closer to 50%. And then if you start to look at your early adopters and people who are really dedicated, right? It's more like 60 or 70% adoption rate over time. So knowing how to target your effort and kind of leverage that kind of change is important. I already talked about sharing the good news, right? There's a lot of good news to share. So being that person, farmers inherently don't like to talk about themselves or show off. So I do that for them. I'll just work through these, right? It helps to have a big sticky issue to work around and kind of bring everyone together on. I talked about charismatic megafauna, really getting to yes. I try to never say no, right? It's like yes and yes, but, or yeah, we can do that, but not right now. We got to figure out a way to get it done, kind of thing. Getting your hands dirty, being in it with them. Definitely, there's no one size fits all. Sticking to the basics. And I truly do believe that if we can keep things voluntary when it comes to environmental regulations, we're going to be in a much better place than if we try to regulate our farmers into it. Because agriculture, really culture is the active word there, right? And so if we can get them to adopt a ethos or a mentality or a system, they are going to adopt it and optimize it. If we tell them they have to, they're going to say by when and how much, and that's where they'll stop, right? But if they decide to do it and they see all the benefits and all their neighbors are doing it, not because they were made to, but because they want to, that's the place to go. Clearly, I love my job, so I'm not going to talk too long about that, but it really is a vocation, not a career or an occupation. Like this is, you don't do it for the money, but you do it because you love agriculture, you love the people you work with, you love extension, you love continuing to learn, right? That's what I love about my job. And I also love that I get all the fun parts of farming, right? Without having like my paycheck tied to it. If I have a crop loss, like, oh, I'll write an article about that. And because I have students here, right? If you want to come over to animal science and do some agronomy over there, we have some options for you. We do have a whole farm nutrient planning class that we offer in the spring, and Animal Science 4120. Green offers an independent study to walk you through taking the CCA exam. And then we have several opportunities for summer internships if you're at all interested in sort of dairy sustainability, digital agriculture extension. And we even have some engineering. And if you're interested in what like crop consultants and nutrient management planners do, we have lots of opportunities with us at ProDairy and in the animal science department. So I have 5 minutes for questions. Happy just to also hear your all's experience or thoughts. It's a great career. Yes.
Thank you very much for visiting us, and hopefully not the last time.
Yeah, I hope not.
Belated welcome. Belated welcome. Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and especially how you say it. That makes me really excited about learning more about your work. I was wondering, you mentioned the resources at a university such as Cornell, and there are a lot of research teaching faculty. What have you seen that works to reach out to those faculty and rope them in to what you're doing and what you need to deliver, what hasn't worked?
Yeah.
Here at Cornell or elsewhere.
Yeah, I think what doesn't work, like from the faculty side of things, I think what doesn't work is when the faculty member says, oh, I have this project because of whatever, it's got an extension component. And like the last year of the project, they're like, hey, we got to have a meeting about this. Like that doesn't work. And so I do think having like, we can proof things out in plots and small scale, but if we start to see some benefit, like how do we get that out on the landscape, and can we do some larger things with farmers? And I think the key is to be, if you can't be there, right, if we're on campus and you can't be everywhere all the time, who are the connections we need to make in that community with that type of farm? Who is their trusted advisor? So that picture of Jody, right, like that's kind of key in our work. And we have extension educators across the state where we can key in with those folks, be partnering with them, provide them with resources through funding or otherwise. They're always looking for money to like keep their job whole. And then they really are the ones that like can tell you where you might want to put that project, what soil types, what farmer is the good cooperator, where if you just sort of be like, oh, that one, right, we can fail miserably. So I think communication is the key, and not just swooping into a place. Like I try not to swoop in. If I'm going to go do a meeting somewhere, I try to like call the extension agent, like, hey, I'm going to be in, you know, Wayne County. Are you going to be there? Like, do you want to help me give this one presentation? Or, you know, which farm should I come visit? Will you come with me? You know, so knowing who those trusted advisors are and having really good communication and being, you know, again, making sure we're solving the farmer's problem, not just being an inconvenience to the farm. Because once you're helping them solve a problem, then like, watch out. We have some farms that call us. I'm sure you guys do too. You're like, oh boy, this is going to take a while, right? And they call you all the time. It's awesome.
Thank you for a very clear, enjoyable presentation.
Thank you.
I liked it. One of the things that you mentioned was the role of looking ahead, what's coming. And the press right now is filled up with information about the use and misuse of artificial intelligence. Does it have any role in research and extension in agriculture that you see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We had like a lunchtime conversation with a animal science master's student where I was like, I don't know about this, you know, AI stuff. And he was really clearly like, well, you better get on the bandwagon or you're going to get left behind, right? And that was like a wake up call, like, yeah, right. So I think the idea, I think we need to figure that out and figure out what, it's like any other tool in our toolbox, what is going to be where we apply it and where we see benefit and where do we want to make sure we don't, because there could be some consequences we don't want to see happen. I don't know the answer to those questions for agriculture right now, but I think it is a good question, and one, frankly, we're probably not paying enough attention to in agriculture. So I don't think, like, I think of artificial intelligence like in a slightly different way about how we model and predict and use that farm data. But like the way that AI is being used now is like a completely different thing. And I think we can't ignore it, even though I kind of want to, because it kind of scares me.
I have maybe one last question.
Yep, and I'll just put my contact info up there.
What have you seen over the last, I mean, all your experience is good ways and how it evolved, good ways to communicate with the farmers? Like maybe website may not have been the best thing 20 years back.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not, still not the
That's
best
a really good question. You know, we think about all the extension bulletins we create and the publications and the websites and the videos. And as unsexy as it sounds, being at their dooryard and talking to them in person, that's still the way to go. It's expensive, it's time consuming, but I still think that's at the top of the list. I think there are still, although I will say cell phones are amazing. Texting, awesome. And understanding so some farms, email, bam, they'll email you right back. They read every newsletter you send, right? There's those farms. And then there's some farms you can call, they'll always pick up. But if you send them an email, they might tell you. I've had farmers tell me once, I don't check my email till January. I was like, whoa, okay, I'm not gonna email you. It's getting a little better on that front. But I do think you need to identify, because I've done printed newsletters, digital newsletters, email campaigns, blah, 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 blah. And it really is understanding whose communication, like you've got to meet them where they're at. And some farms, it's just you show up, or you call their wife, or you call their daughter or their son, or who is the right person at the farm. And that you only get with practice and relationship building and time. But I do think it's worth continuing an extension to canvas and ask, what's the best way to get communication to you? Here we're in New York, right? We have a lot of plain sex people, and clearly I'm not going to email them, text them, or call them on their cell phone. I have to wait to be invited, frankly, as a female, to come and speak at one of their meetings, and I have to have the trust of one of their trusted advisors to at all be heard, right? Where some farms, like I said, I can send them a research paper and they've read it and digested it and have 10 questions for me by the next day. And some people just saw it on Instagram or Facebook. So I think having all the things out there, and I think science communication and having professionals who are really good at that to help us is super important.
Great. Thank you very much, Kirsten. That was a great conversation.
Email, call, not off limits. If you're at all interested in internships or whatever, come to me.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.